Hello everyone, welcome back to our lecture series on the political history of modern Japan. And the topic of my talk today is the politics of war memory in Japan and East Asia. In previous talks, I've already looked at how war memory has been used as a political tool and some of the political utilities of war memory. Well, in previous talks, I just did that, kind of in a secondary way. But today, I'm going to go into more detail on that specific topic and to cite some examples, not only from Japan, but also in the cases of China and Korea as well. And as we know, war memory in Japan and in East Asia today continues to be a topic of perennial concern for not just scholarly concern, but for geopolitical relations between East Asian nations. And it has often served as a point of contention, unfortunately, but at the same time, some people and some groups see within war memory possibilities for reconciliation and for improved ties as well. So we'll look at some of these political uses of Asia-Pacific war memories in detail in today's talk. Okay, so as I mentioned, the title of my talk is The Politics of War Memory in Japan and East Asia. And first I want to start by looking at the evolution of war memory in Japan. One important thing to remember is that memory is not static. It's constantly changing. It's constantly being updated and revised from the vantage point of the present. So a lot of what memory is not just an accurate recall of the past. It's largely, instead, how groups and individuals want to remember the past, and in that process, how they want to remember themselves. So this is why memories of past events tend to change over time. They're updated to fit different socio-political situations. Okay, so the first time period then that I want to start by looking at is the immediate post-war and occupation period. And the General Headquarters Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers launched a war guilt program, published works such as The History of the Pacific War, and did a radio series titled Now It Can Be Told. But above all of this, perhaps one of the most important actions that the Allied powers, especially the United States, took to, or in relation to Japanese war memory and also how the war was remembered and how responsibility for the war was assigned, was the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, also known as the Tokyo Trials. So all of these efforts were efforts to try to explain the war, to try to assign responsibility. And in that process, they're promoting a certain way of remembering the war that certainly was much different than how the war was viewed during wartime Japan. So attitudes and ideas and opinions, beliefs changed dramatically from wartime to immediate post-war. And behind that was this updated geopolitical situation of the U.S. or the Allied occupation of Japan. The occupation did spread information about Japanese war atrocities. However, this was done in a rather one-sided way. For instance, Allied atrocities were not investigated or tried as war crimes at all. For instance, the carpet bombing of 66 major Japanese cities to near complete destruction, or the atomic bombings in which hundreds of thousands of people were killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and these were civilians, women and children, elderly, that were killed in those bombings. Those things were not tried as war crimes. So there is a bit of one-sidedness going on here. And the Allies also promoted the idea that, especially certain individuals within the U.S., military leadership, as we've looked at in previous lectures, they emphasized the idea that Japan had been hijacked and that the emperor had been deceived by a small band of militarists who led the country into a reckless war. So this was a way to try to assign responsibility, to pin responsibility on a certain group of individuals, especially a small cabal of military leaders, and try to absolve the emperor of any wartime military responsibility, even though the emperor gave the his final stamp of approval on all major war policies, including the initial declaration of war against the U.S. and the U.K. Okay, but as you can see already, so there's, in this period, war memories are being shaped. Okay, so Japan then regained its sovereignty in 1952, and along with that, there was a revival of nationalism. And again, some of this is review from previous lectures, but the Yoshida cabinet, for instance, transformed the police force into the self-defense forces, as I looked at in the last lecture. Also, he held, under his tenure, the first national memorial ceremony for the war dead, and this was focused on kensho, which is like commemoration, basically. But it's commemorating plus honoring the war dead. And this is a little bit different. This is an official remembrance of bestowing honor, basically, posthumous honor on the war dead. And also at this time, financial aid for former military families and war bereaved was revived, including the old military pension system. At the same time, there were also efforts, especially at the civic level in Japanese society, to uncover and expose Japanese war crimes, such as forced labor, war crimes and forced labor, such as, for instance, in the 1951 Japan-China Friendship Association held a memorial service for 586 Chinese forced laborers who had been working in the Hanaoka mines and had been killed there. And then the group Chukiren, this is a group of repatriates organized around former Japanese soldiers who had been held prisoner of war in China and then were repatriated. So they had close connections and had a very positive view of China and wanted to foster friendly relations between the two nations. They published a book called The Three Alls, a Sangko. Now this derived from the Three All policy that the Japanese military had adopted in China of killing all, looting all, and burning all. So there's a deep reflection on Japanese military crimes in this work. This came out in 1957. And then Pak Kyung-sik's The Record of Korean Forced Mobilization was released in 1965 as well. So there are these efforts to uncover, Japanese war crimes. At the same time, there are also opposite efforts, counter efforts in popular culture. For example, the revisionist accounts of Hayashi Fusao, who in 1963 penned the affirmative thesis on the Greater East Asian War, Daito wa Senso Koteidon. So trying to justify, argue that the Asia-Pacific War was justified, that Japan was fighting a war of Asian, quote, liberation. But this competed with these other works that I mentioned, as well as more broad selection of what, just broadly fall under the rubric of anti-war pacifist depictions, such as Gomikawa Shunpei's 1956 to 1958 The Human Condition, and Ibuse Masuji's 1965 Black Rain. Okay. In the 1970s, war memory again underwent another shift in Japan, and this is especially against the background of mass opposition to the Vietnam War and strengthening anti-US sentiment as well. And in this context, Oda Makoto and some others formed a group called Bayheden to oppose the Vietnam War and to assist U.S. soldiers who wanted to desert, basically. So U.S. soldiers were coming through Japan, stationed at bases here, and Bayheden, Oda Makoto and his group would help or try to advocate for U.S. soldiers to desert and to not fight in Vietnam, which they argued was a mistaken war. They were critical of Japan lending support to the U.S. for the Vietnam War, and we've looked at this in previous lectures in the case of mass protests that were organized against that. But what I really want to emphasize here is within this there is a reflection on the past victimization of Asians in the Asia-Pacific War as well. So Oda Makoto wrote in an essay titled The Ethics of Peace about a realization that we ourselves may have been in the past and could become in the future, or actually are at present, victimizers as well as victims, is a prerequisite to effective denunciation of Allied hypocrisy. So what he means here is he's referring to this idea that largely stemmed, or partly stemmed at least, out of transformations from the time of the U.S. occupation, that individual Japanese themselves, or Japanese society, didn't bear too much wartime responsibility, and rather that they too had been victims or victimized in the war. And while, of course, that was partly true, it was also true that most Japanese basically had to actively assist the war effort. So in a sense, responsibility should have been kind of spread out or diffused among society in a way, as well as assigned to these military leaders. But what makes Oda Makoto and others realize this, especially what makes it hit home for them, is in the Vietnam War, Japan is hosting U.S. military bases, is supporting the U.S. in the war to drop bombs basically against North Vietnam and also in Laos and Cambodia. And that was so clearly mistaken. That was such a wrong policy in the eyes of Oda Makoto and others. And they wanted to oppose this, and so they drew these connections between the Japanese military in China in the Asia-Pacific War and the Americans in Vietnam in the Vietnam War, and that they're both these kind of imperialist wars that are victimizing other Asians. And so finally, they saw this kind of joint responsibility then, that there was a past responsibility that Japan had to other Asians for being a victimizer in World War II, as well as this ongoing kind of responsibility of acting as victimizer again. And in this climate, then Honda Katsuichi wrote Travels in China for the Asahi Shimbun. It was later released, compiled as a book, and it focused on Japanese war crimes against Chinese civilians. So again, this has to be read, in the context of the Vietnam War, that this is happening again. This emphasis that this is happening again, that Japan is once again acting as a victimizer. So there's this really strong opposition to the Vietnam War based on this past reflection. And then in 1965 and 1967, from 1965 and 1967 to the early 1990s, the historian Ienaga Sabudo launched a number of court cases against the Japanese government for censoring history textbooks, and he argued that the Ministry of Education's textbook screening was unconstitutional. And so his efforts in court attracted a lot of attention to the issue of war history and war memory, because a lot of what he was saying was being censored by the government were precisely critical accounts of Japan's role in the Asia-Pacific War. Okay, and then in the 1980s, in 1982 specifically, the government of Japan angered China and Korea when it censored history textbooks. So again, you can see how this is related to Ienaga Saburo's court trials, but it really attracted international attention in this year. And at that time, they had changed what particularly irked other East Asian nations was that the Ministry of Education had changed the wording of invasion or aggression, shinryaku, in these history textbooks to advance, shinshutsu. So trying to downplay rhetorically the idea that Japan had launched a war of invasion. Well, this invited a huge international backlash, and the government of Japan was forced to backtrack on this issue to undo its changes, and even on top of that, to issue what was known as the Neighboring Country Clause, or Kinrin Shokoku Jokyo, which I'll look at in the next slide in more detail, but it basically said that when issuing these guidelines for history textbooks, that the government of Japan, the Ministry of Education, would have to be also considerate of the views of its neighbors, of its neighboring countries. And in 1985, another instance that attracted a lot of attention, Prime Minister Nakasone officially worshipped at Yasukuni's shrine. And this also attracted such a strong backlash that in 1986, the government declared that it wouldn't conduct any more official worship at the shrine and that it would consider Asian countries' feelings. In a 1986 Diet questioning, Nakasone also clarified his personal view that the Asia-Pacific War was indeed a war of aggression, shinryaku-teki. So then, in this climate, against this background, school history textbooks became emboldened to question Japan's war responsibility, and there was increasing coverage of war crimes and atrocities, such as the Nanking Massacre, Unit 731, and the so-called Comfort Women issue, Jugun Yanfu. Now here is, this is from the Neighboring Countries Clause that I mentioned in the last slide, and it read in part, "The Japanese government and the Japanese people are deeply aware of the fact that acts by our country in the past caused tremendous suffering and damage to the peoples of Asian countries, including the Republic of Korea and China, and have followed the path of a pacifist state with remorse and determination that such acts must never be repeated. From the perspective of building friendship and goodwill with neighboring countries, Japan will pay due attention to these criticisms from China and Korea and make corrections to textbooks at the government's responsibility." So this is this Neighboring Countries Clause, which was adopted in response to the backlash over the Ministry of Education's changing or censorship, if you will, of school history textbooks. And again, we can also read this in the context of past lectures, as we've looked at, of the increased economic interconnectedness between East Asian nations at this time. And Japan was very focused on, being a major economic power in the world and in Asia, and in maintaining ties with Asian nations to benefit from trade. So it did want to be careful with how it approached issues of war memory. And it would, as we've seen in previous lectures as well, Japanese conservatives and right-wing politicians will often try to pander to their base by taking a very nationalistic stance internally, and then apologizing and backtracking on that in order to cater to the international community. And Yoshida Yutaka incidentally refers to this as, I believe, kind of, the dual nature of official Japanese war memory. Okay, in the 1990s then, we reach a turning point. So, as I mentioned in the last slide, the government and politicians had increasingly adopted a more contrite, conciliatory stance in regards to Asia-Pacific war memory and history. In 1993, Chief Cabinet Secretary Kono Yohei admitted the government of Japan's role in running the Comfort Women system, and apologized, issued an apology for that. In 1993, Prime Minister Hosokawa admitted that it was a war of aggression, and successive speeches on August 15th, the end of the Asia-Pacific War, continued this trend to admit that it was a war of aggression. In 1995, Prime Minister Murayama also issued an official apology for the war, Fusen Ketsugi. In the 1990s, an NHK survey found that 53% of people thought that the Asia-Pacific War was a war of aggression. So this is basically the high watermark then. 1995 was the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II in Asia, and there was a lot of memorial ceremonies and official remembrances, public remembrances happening at that time. And there's an increased trend in Japanese society to reflect on Japanese war responsibility. However, that proved to be a high watermark, and after this, the waters kind of receded, to continue with that same analogy. So there's a backlash, basically, from groups of right-wing historical revisionists, and we'll see it in just a minute in some different slides what revisionist means, but basically it's going against the idea that Japan fought a war of aggression. These revisionists are arguing that it wasn't a war of aggression, it was a war of, quote, liberation of Asia from Western imperialism, that Japan was the good guy in World War II. So that's why they're referred to as revisionists, basically. And revisionists such as Fujioka Nobukatsu, professor of education at Tokyo University, formed a group such as the Liberal View of History Study Group, Jiyu Shugi Shikan Kenkyukai, and in 1977, they and others also formed the Japanese Society for History Textbook Reform, Atarashi Rekishi Kyokasho o Tsukurukai, or just as will be abbreviated from here on out, Tsukurukai. So they wanted to write a new textbook, basically, to promote their views that Japan was the good guy in World War II to young students in school. And also in 1997, there was a formation of right-wing political group, the Japan Conference, Nihon Kaigi. They also sought to erase the history of Japanese war crimes, portray the Asia-Pacific War as a just war of self-defense and Asian, quote, liberation. Then moving on to 2000s to the present. Well, the Tsukurukai and the right-wing revisionists initially were not so successful. Their textbook only captured 1% of the market share, but they did force other publishers to self-censor their coverage of controversial events. And this is not they literally forced them to, but just the fact that they were leading this right-wing push and attracting attention to these issues, it became a more repressive climate, basically, and other publishers essentially, as I write here, self-censored in relation to how they depicted the war. There was also just a revival of right-wing nationalism in general under Abe Shinzo in 2006 and 7, and 2012 to, well, not the present anymore, so this slide needs to be updated, but until quite recently. Abe and other LDP politicians and members of the Japan Conference, their influence was strengthening during this time. And Abe, in his 2015 August speech commemorating the end of the war, broke with tradition and made no apology for the war. Along with revisions to history textbooks, these groups also sought to revise the Constitution in Article 9 to remilitarize Japan, as we looked at in detail in our last lecture. And again, this is related to memories of the Asia-Pacific War because they're trying to foster a sense of patriotism and nationalism amongst the youth, to say that, hey, war, it's not such a bad thing. Militaries, they're pretty good. Japan should have one too, something like that. Others like Tamogami Toshio, Hyakuta Naoki, Sakurai Yoshiko denied the Comfort Women Nanking Massacre and denounced the Tokyo trials. I'm going to talk more about this in detail in the following slide, so I'll just skip right ahead to that. Okay, so I want to look in a little bit more detail at the connections between nationalism and history, or nationalism and memory, we could also say. And in discussing this, I'm drawing especially from a great article by Sven Soller titled Nationalism and History in Contemporary Japan from the Asia-Pacific journal Japan Focus, October 2016. And Soller writes that history has served as the core of nationalism. And what he means by this is that from the 19th century, historians in all modern nation states basically attempted to find common national histories to serve as a basis for national identity and to legitimatize the existence of the nation state. But some of this led to the development of what were basically mytho-histories, histories that were based on semi or completely mythical figures or events, simply to foster increased nationalism and belief that one's nation state was superior to others. In Japan, statues of, there were statues then of two famous mytho-historical figures, not just in Japan, but around the world. And in Japan, this was especially illustrated through statues erected to Jimmu Tenno, or the Emperor Jimmu. He was the legendary first emperor of Japan, and many of these statues were built in the 1880s and 90s. The idea, again, was that Japanese history was based on a shared origin that could be traced back to the gods, because Jimmu, Emperor Jimmu, was supposed to be the great-great-grandson of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. And the same idea that Japan was basically, quote, the land of the gods, was illustrated by the idea of Bansei Ikke, or an eternally unbroken imperial line ranging all the way, again, from Jimmu Tenno to the present-day emperor. Now, of course, this theory doesn't hold any water if you look at the history of the imperial lineage. There are many different cases where it's completely broken, or others are brought in from the outside to carry on the tradition or inherit the throne. But nevertheless, that doesn't make for a very compelling nationalistic narrative, apparently. So this idea, in a way, still kind of remains. After World War II, this type of mytho-historical nationalism basically dropped off the radar. I said it still remained, but it did, and definitely, kind of was forced underground, basically, since it lost a lot of credence after Japan's loss and defeat in the war. But different kinds of nationalism took its place, like cultural nationalism, for instance. And then in the 1960s, the idea of Japan as, quote, land of the gods made a comeback. The pre-war national holiday of the mythical foundation of Japan by Jimmu was reintroduced as National Foundation Day in 1966. And some Japanese cities even re-erected statues of Jimmu Tenno. Moreover, in 2016, and after that as well, the emperor and empress visited Jimmu's supposed tomb in Kashihara in Nara Prefecture. Then there was a revival of nationalism celebrating Japan's wartime past from the 1990s. And this is kind of overlapping with the material I mentioned in the last slide, but these historical revisionists wanted to revise the idea that Japan was an historical aggressor in the war. They battled over Japanese history textbooks I've mentioned, such as the Tsukurukai, and they had close links to the ruling LDP. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. One of the main LDP supporters, as I also mentioned, was Abe Shinzo. He praised Japanese nationalism, visited Yasukuni, doubted the system of wartime sexual slavery, condemned the Tokyo trials as, quote, victor's justice. And this was all part of what he meant when he said that he wanted to end the, quote, post-war regime, to get rid of this idea of what he thought was victor's justice. As I mentioned, though, in the context of previous lectures, much of this has become clear in the context of previous lectures. Much of this was just posturing. Abe and other LDP members don't actually want to end the U.S.-Japan security relationship. Rather, they want to strengthen it militarily and economically in a way that is mutually beneficial for elites on both sides. Other politicians, and elites shared Abe's revisionist views. I mentioned Tamogami Toshio, the former chief of staff of the JASDF and leader of right-wing group Gambare Nippon. He was one such figure. He argued in one book that Japan should have nuclear weapons. I would note here, as we'll talk about in a future lecture, that it already basically does in a way, since it can manufacture them at any time. But Tamogami called his opponents traitors for selling out Japan to foreign countries. But again, I would point out that he's not really anti-US, and lots of this is just posturing. Then Hyakuta Naoki, the writer of the famous book and a best-selling book and famous movie Eternal Zero, and also on the board of governors at NHK, was another notable revisionist. He said that the Nanking Massacre was a fabrication in 2014. He described left-wing people as, quote, human scum, and he co-authored a book with Abe in 2013. Another has been Watanabe Shoichi, who wrote a lot of books in which he attacked China and Korea and denied the Nanking Massacre and other wartime atrocities. Also, Okawa Ryuho, founder of the Science of Happiness New Religion, the political party, wants to rearm Japan and get nukes. He and his party also deny the Nanking Massacre. Sakurai Yoshiko is another, a TV personality, and there are quite a few others too, including Kobayashi Yoshinori, a manga artist. But notably, as Soller likes to point out, there are no historians amongst this group. Well, initially the historical revisionists didn't do so well. Their really awesome textbook, that's sarcasm by the way, only gained less than 1% of the market share. Then they tried to work through the second Abe administration and focused especially on implementing, quote, patriotic education in schools. By 2016, one right-wing textbook actually captured 6.5% of the market share, so their influence definitely has been growing. This has been led by the Kyokasho Kaizen no Kai, which Soller hilariously abbreviates as KKK. Anyone familiar with American history will understand why that is funny. The textbooks were even adopted in schools in big cities like Osaka and Yokohama. And also kind of hilariously, I think, in one of their textbooks there were more than 10 photographs of Abe. And it emphasized Japanese cultural superiority in general. Under Abe, critical content basically disappeared from school textbooks. Wartime history was downplayed, while territorial disputes, which were actually quite marginal to people's daily lives, were blown up into huge national issues. Then there was the reintroduction of morality classes as well. In the pre-war period, there were moral education shushin courses in which students learned about how great Japan was. Well, these were abolished in 1947 during the U.S. occupation, and they weren't revived until 2007 under the first Abe regime. And at this time, the courses were renamed Dotoku, which also just translates as morality, but different Japanese terms, so apparently it's supposed to have different, invoke different connotations in people's minds, I guess. Now students have to develop a, quote, deepening love for the nation. Meanwhile, as LDP scandals routinely showed, the LDP couldn't live up to its own purported morals. And in 2015, one 2015 textbook, Our Morals, even argued that citizens' rights are contingent on their ability to fulfill duties. So what it's implying here is that, citizens should go happily fight and die for their country, and that this is their duty upon which their rights are contingent. Well, that's actually not how modern democracies work. There is something called the inherent rights of man, for instance, which is typically regarded as an essential point of democratic societies. So, indeed, there are some rather, disturbing, trends happening in school textbooks, as this article by Sven Soller has shown. Okay, I want to move on then to also look at the evolution of war memory in China and Korea. And there's a lot of overlap here. Of course, historically, the connections, the wartime connections, wartime history joins all of these nations, but how they have remembered the war, it does differ a bit and takes slightly different trajectories while overlapping at the same time. Okay, so first, war memory in China, and here I'm drawing especially from an article by James Riley, the short title of which is Remember History, Not Hatred, published in Modern Asian Studies in 2011. And he identifies four general periods that the evolution of war memory went through in China. The first, a long period of benevolent amnesia to 1982. The second, a period of patriotic education from the mid-1980s. Third, a period of history activism from the late 1990s. And fourth, a reversal from 2005. So first, the period of benevolent amnesia. And this was a period of forgetting or downplaying Japan's war crimes and aggression. Chiang Kai-shek of the Nationalists even said in August 1945, "We harbored no enmity for the Japanese people," and that they even sympathized with their plight. This is not true. This is not only true for the Nationalists, but also for the Communists as well. The CCP held military tribunals, but there was no death penalty or life imprisonment. And by 1956, all non-indicted POWs were allowed to return home. So there's a strong focus among both the Nationalists and later victorious Communist Party that they were not going to hold the Japanese people individually accountable for the war. There was also an emphasis on how war responsibility was basically assigned again to a small group of elite, military, political, and economic leaders. And this is all done in a desire to foster friendly relationships, but also kind of to win allies among average Japanese people. Zhou Enlai in 1954 also similarly said that the war is, quote, "a thing of the past. Compared to the history of a few thousand years, the history of 60 years is not worth bringing up." And as I mentioned, there's a political goal of fostering good ties with Japan to counterbalance the USSR. We often think of, Sino-Soviet relations in the Cold War as, kind of being on one side of the Cold War, but in fact, issues were not so simple. China and Russia even fought a war at one point, and in many ways, their approaches to the Cold War and to many things was actually quite different. So for a time, China did pursue closer relations to Japan, and this culminated with the 1972 normalization of relations between the two countries. But from the mid-1980s, there was another change. So there was a rapprochement with the USSR. Some of the Sino-Soviet differences were reconciled. And there was also, at the same time, increasing anxiety over Japan's growing military and alliance with the US. So in this context, war memory in China underwent another shift, and places of remembrance, sites of remembrance, such as the Memorial Hall for the victims of the Nanking Massacre were built in 1984, the Memorial Hall of the People's War of Resistance against Japan, constructed in 1987, And from 1990, there was a patriotic education campaign introduced to enhance support for the state. One school textbook also referred to, quote, Japanese devils and, quote, bestial crimes against humanity conducted by Japanese troops. So increasing criticism of the Japanese military, of Japanese wartime atrocities, not just criticism, but attention drawn to them in general, and this is increasingly becoming important to Chinese national identity from this time. Then a period of history activism from the late 1990s. Chinese activists began demanding compensation, commemoration, and apologies in particular. There was a boycott of Japanese goods, for instance, and massive street protests in 2005 against Japanese efforts seeking a seat on the UN Security Council, to the point where the government even had to deploy riot police. But the government actually helped create the social conditions for this strong opposition. At the same time, these exceeded what it expected and could handle. And it even threatened to damage diplomatic and economic relations with Japan. So this is obviously, not the Chinese government as well wants to utilize war memory to foster support for the state and to promote kind of a strong national stance internally, but externally it doesn't want to do anything that would irreparably damage relations with Japan. So from 2005, there was kind of a period of reversal in which the government cracked down on anti-Japanese activism. There were also shows of friendship between Abe Shinzo and Premier Wen Jiabao in 2006, and they emphasized the narrative that it was a handful of militarists who were responsible for the war, and that China and Japan should, quote, live in friendship. In 2008, President Hu Jintao also stressed the, quote, mutually beneficial strategic relationship with Japan without mentioning Japanese war crimes or responsibilities. The government would also utilize museums, veterans' memories, etc. to emphasize strong and heroic China without a strong criticism of Japan, and even began to praise the Guomindang stories in history. But the Chinese commercial media, on the other hand, did focus on sensational coverage of Japan's war crimes and atrocities to stoke popular nationalism. And now the government is basically trying to balance international diplomacy with and economic concerns with domestic political and economic concerns. Okay, let's look at the situation in Korea a little bit. And here I am especially drawing on a short article by Don Baker titled Memory Wars and Prospects for Reconciliation in South Korea in Mi-kyung Kim, in a book volume edited by Mi-kyung Kim, the Rutledge Handbook of Memory and Reconciliation in East Asia, published by Rutledge in 2016. And he identifies as well a number of different periods. So again, we can see in all three cases, anyway, war memories change in response to the geopolitical situation. So again, this is partly what we mean when we say the politics of war memory. And he identifies conflicted memories of four traumatic events. The first was Japanese colonialism from 1910 to 1945. The second was the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. Third was the Park Chung-hee dictatorship from 1961 to 79. And fourth was the Gwangju uprising of May 1980. And all of these, in a way, are all, of course, connected to the period of wartime history. So this is why we can examine all of these events under the common rubric of war memory. The first period, Japanese colonialism. Now, regarding this period, history textbooks have portrayed a nearly universal resistance to Japanese colonialism, but the reality was that, quote, as Baker says, in order to survive, most Koreans had to cooperate with their Japanese overlords. Nevertheless, there's the common idea that it was just a few evil collaborators who cooperated with the Japanese. And the Korean right, especially, has tried to narrowly define the term collaboration, while the left in Korea has been a bit more probing of individual war responsibility. And during the Korean War, the official narrative of this was that the North launched a sudden and unprovoked attack on the South, and that Koreans, quote, unanimously were opposed to communism. But again, here the reality was much more different. There were many leftists in Korea who opposed the war or supported the North, and some of this has been reflected in popular culture as well. Recent films such as the 1994 The Taibak Mountain Range and 2004 The Brotherhood of War shows good guys and bad guys on both sides, as well as the reluctance of many youth to fight against family members, as the war obviously deeply divided many families. Also, recent scholarship has begun to show atrocities committed by South Korean and U.S. troops as well. During the Park, or in relation to these traumatic memories of the Park dictatorship and how this should be remembered, there's been conflict over whether Park Chung-hee should be remembered for boosting the Korean economy or for his human rights abuses. And the 2012 election of his daughter, Park Gyung-hee, showed that many Koreans favored focusing on his economic record instead. Also, the Park Chung-hee Presidential Library and Museum praise him while forgetting the atrocities he committed. And along with this, forgetting the history of Park's collaboration with the Japanese. But some scholarship, like 2012 Lee Chong-sik's detailed biography of Park's life, have, prior to 1961, have challenged this perception. And then in relation to the Gwangju tragedy, Chun Do-hwan led a coup d'etat to prevent free elections, and there were large protests in Gwangju, the home of the opposition leader, Kim Dae-jung. Chun sent military forces to violently crack down and ended up killing 1,000 to 2,000 protesters and crushing the nascent democracy movement there. After Korean democratization, people could freely discuss the Gwangju tragedy, and now there is a democracy festival there. But there's been disagreement over how to remember the protesters. Were they peace lovers, freedom fighters, or North Korean spies? Even though this latter one has been a largely rejected conspiracy theory. So in any case, this still remains a controversial event of how to remember this early pro-democracy movement. Okay, in conclusion, we can say that, basically, not just Japanese war memories, but war memories in general are complex. And in Japan, they've ranged from fiercely critical of the war, military, or emperor, to historical revisionist, which have denied Japan's war atrocities and aggression. We can also say that memories change and shift as time goes on and in response to socio-historical backgrounds such as the Vietnam War, economic downturns, and international pressures. I'd also like to note that right-wing revisionism and politics in general have been increasing across the globe in response to the crises of capitalism and climate change, but opposition remains high and progressive groups seek future peace and equity based on critical investigations of past crimes and injustices. And this is what I mean by I personally am positive and quite hopeful for the possibility of reconciliation through remembering. And this is why I think war memory is so important, and it's so important that we do make honest efforts as historians to uncover and to confront the past. But at the same time, right-wing political leaders as well, and nationalists, neo-nationalists, historical revisionists, also try to use and manipulate war memory in different ways. So in any case, it's important to recognize that both of these tendencies and possibilities exist. Memories of the Asia-Pacific War in China and Korea as well have changed throughout the post-war to meet current socio-political needs in the climate. Much history of Japanese aggression and atrocity was downplayed at first, only to be later revived, especially in China. The government has dedicated a balancing act between promoting official narratives and catering to the demands of civil society. Increased democratization in China may lead to greater uncovery of hidden past truths, but also at the same time, as I've mentioned, this could be, used in different ways, either to promote or hinder reconciliation. Okay, and that is the end of my talk for today. I hope you found this to be a useful talk, and the information I presented here to be enlightening. It's a very interesting topic for me. I started out in my researching war memory, and this has remained a long time interest of mine, and it's also, I think, at the same time very much related to politics in how memory. It's important to note how memory has, and memories of the Asia-Pacific War especially, have been used in different ways to serve different political needs and interests. So, thank you very much for listening.